City Retirement Systems Common Investment Meeting for October 18th, 2017. We're going to call the roll for each of the funds. So let's start with the Fire Pension Fund. Lee? You got to turn your mic on.
Okay.
This is Lee Tian.
Mr. John Adler? Ms. Susanna Vickers? Here. Mr. Philip Dukes?
Here.
Mr. Gerard Fitzgerald?
Eddie Brown has a proxy for Gerard Fitzgerald.
Mr. Leroy McGinnis?
Tom Phelan for Leroy McGinnis.
And Mr. Edward Brown?
Yeah.
Mr. John Kelly?
Tom Phelan for John Kelly.
And Mr. Thomas Phelan?
Here.
Mr. Jack Kilty?
John Farina has Jack Kelty's proxy.
And Mr. John Farina?
John Farina is here.
Mr. Paul Mannix?
Paul Mannix is here.
Commissioner Douglas White will be here shortly. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Lee. Okay, next, let's do the Police Pension Fund. Kevin?
Good morning. Representing the PBA,
Who are you, Kevin? Sorry.
Kevin Holleran.
Thank you.
Merritt Riley, proxy for Patrick Lynch.
Representing the DEA,
Lou Turco, I have the proxy for Mike Palladino.
LBA,
LBA, Lou Turco.
CEA,
Roy Richter, CEA.
SBA,
Gary DeRosa, designee for Ed Mullins.
representing the Mayor,
John Adler, representing Mayor Bill de Blasio.
Commissioner of Finance,
Cynthia Collins, representing Commissioner
Police Commissioner,
Stephanie Zimberg, designee for the Police Commissioner.
and the Comptroller.
John Dorsey representing Comptroller Scott Stringer.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Kevin. Next, let's move to New York City Employees Retirement System. Melanie, would you introduce yourself first? Put your mic on, sorry.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, Melanie Winery, NICERS, Chair, Mayor's Office,
John Adler.
Comptroller's Office,
David Jeter, representing Controller Scott Stringer.
Public Advocate's Office,
Good morning, Umair Khan for the Public Advocate.
Borough President Manhattan, Borough President Brooklyn, Borough President Bronx,
Ray Sanchez on behalf of Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr.
Borough President Queens, Borough President Staten Island, International Brotherhood of Teamsters,
Patricia Stryker.
Transport Workers Union,
Dave Katzman.
DC 37.
Ray Santander here for Henry Garrido.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, Melanie. Next, I'm going to ask Sandy Rich from Burrs to check in here.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. We are represented by our chairman, Mr. Raymond Orlando. We are otherwise without quorum. We will administer this business at our next board meeting, October 25th, in Staten Island, for anyone interested.
Thank you, Mr. Rich. And let me just note that we're not going to call the Teachers Board to order at this time because the first item of business on the agenda is not for the Teachers Retirement System. We'll call them to order later in the meeting.
I'm Scott Evans, Chief Investment Officer. As you know, the four systems, excluding teachers, have contracted for us to articulate the carbon footprint of the holdings in our portfolio. And we've procured TrueCost, who's one of the leaders in the field, to assess our portfolio and to give us a read on what the carbon exposure is today. And so we have the folks from TrueCost here. I believe that James Sallow will be speaking on their behalf for starting, and so I'm just going to turn it over to James to give you the presentation, the readout on the portfolio. James?
Thank you very much. And I may, during the presentation today, refer to my colleague here, Grace Cow, as well, to answer any questions. Does everybody have, do we have the slides for the presentation, or are they?
They're up.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much. So, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us this morning to present the results of our analysis. Specifically, this analysis was looking at the carbon footprint of the public equity portfolios for the four systems. Today, what we'll do is briefly just touch on the agenda and then quickly review the scope of the work that we did before really diving into the high-level summary of our findings. But what I'd like to do is really have quite a bit of time available for any questions or discussion that you'd like to have. If there are any clarifying points that you'd like to raise during the presentation, please feel free to interject clarification on the slides. Otherwise, there will be time at the end for discussion and questions. So for this project, what we did was we analyzed the carbon footprint of the public equity holdings of 4 of the New York City retirement systems. So in this case, the Employees Retirement System, the Police Public Pension Fund, the Fire Pension Fund, and the Board of Education Retirement System. And I want to be very clear when we're talking about that there's an understanding of what we're talking about carbon footprint. So in this case, what we were specifically looking at for each company equity holding within a portfolio, we're looking at what is classified as each company's Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions. And let me really kind of pick apart what that means to hopefully translate that into common sense for you. When we say Scope 1 emissions, what that means is for any direct holding that you might have, if it's Apple or if it's otherwise, they will have operational greenhouse gas emissions from their facilities that they directly own, from their fleet of cars or trucks that they own. So it's anything that directly comes from oil, gas, fossil fuels that they consume, or from refrigerants that might be in their air conditioners or the like. So really it's that, their core operational greenhouse gas emissions. That's the first part of it. Scope 2 is the greenhouse gas emissions associated with any electricity that they purchase. That's the primary source. So you consume electricity. If you're buying that off the grid, that electricity is being generated from a mix of different fuel sources. Some of those are fossil fuel sources, which have greenhouse gas emissions associated with them. So those are the 2 key sources of greenhouse gas emissions that we wanted to include in this particular analysis. The key measures that we were looking at in this assessment were, 1, the total carbon emissions, that is the total greenhouse gas emissions for each system. And when we do this, we don't want to look at the total greenhouse gas emissions associated with each company that you hold. We want to apportion it to the amount of ownership you have in a particular company. So if you own 1% of company X, you will own 1% of their greenhouse gas emissions. This allows us to essentially get an indication as to what your total ownership of greenhouse gas emissions would be for each of the systems. So I have a total quantity. That's useful, but it's also useful to have an indication as to relatively how carbon intensive each of the portfolios might be. So we, in this assessment, actually looked at several different carbon intensity measures to get an indication on how much greenhouse gas emissions were being emitted per unit of output. So in this case, this presentation here, that we will really focus on when greenhouse gas emissions are normalized by a company's revenue. So those are the 2 key measures that we focused on in this assessment. Before I go further, I want to just set the context as far as what else is happening out there in the public pension fund, in the pension fund landscape with regards to the measurement of carbon footprinting. This is something that there has been a significant growth in activity recently. As you can see from this slide, there have been things like public pledges, the Montreal Public Pledge, where there's now $10 trillion of assets under management that specifically their investors have committed to measuring and disclosing the carbon footprint of their investments. There also are an increasing amount of regulations that are encouraging investors in public pension funds to disclose their greenhouse gas emission. This is happening in Sweden and France and in other places. So just so you have some context as to the broader landscape, there's a significant amount of activity, and more pension funds are disclosing this kind of information. This first slide of the results specifically shows how much greenhouse gas emissions are coming from each system. As you can see from this slide, the emissions, which are in that dark blue, are relative compared to the total value of investments that are within each of the systems. So as you go down by the size of the assets under management, the greenhouse gas emissions are really proportional to that. So that's as we would expect. So that's the first high-level view you can see in both the presentation and in the associated reports what the quantitative total greenhouse gas emissions are for each system. The next thing I want to highlight is the relative greenhouse gas intensity of each system compared to their benchmark. As you can see in this slide, the carbon intensity measure that we're looking at here quite closely tracks the underlying benchmark. So in this case, we're always within about 1% of the benchmark's greenhouse gas emissions. There are slight differences, but both across the systems and across the systems compared to their benchmarks, their carbon intensities are very similar. I would specifically say that this is quite a common finding when you're looking at pension funds and institutional investors, which are more leaning towards universal owners, where you will have a very close correlation between those two measures. Now, as we look specifically at the driving factors for what is really the source of the greenhouse gas emissions, across all the investments within each system, there's three key industry sectors that account for the vast majority, over 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions, and those are electricity generating utilities, energy companies, and companies involved in materials. That is also not an uncommon finding to see there's a significant concentration of greenhouse gas emission within those three sectors in particular. If you go a little bit further and look at a specific company level, there's also a significant concentration of greenhouse gas emissions within the top companies. So in this slide, we're looking at the top 10 contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions of each system. As you can see, those top 10 contributors only account for about 2% of the total value of the holdings, but over 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So disproportionately related. That's going to be because a lot of them are, again, electricity generating utilities or energy companies that are quite carbon intensive as far as the sectors that they operate in. Those are the key aspects of the analysis I really wanted to focus on. I wanted to open it up for questions and discussions. I don't know if there's clarification of any of the content on these slides. Also happy to discuss any questions about the reports themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Trucost? Mr. Bonilla, just introduce yourself, who you represent, which system, because you weren't here when we did the roll call. And actually, let's just, if you don't mind, let's just take one moment to have folks who came here after roll call introduce themselves. Let's start with NYSERS. So go.
Angelina Martinez Rubio, representing Queensborough President Melinda Katz.
Aldrin Bonilla, nicest trustee for the Office of the Manhattan Borough President.
Andrew Gennardis, Brooklyn Borough President's Office.
Okay, are there any other trustees from other systems that arrived after we did the roll call? Okay, great. Now, Aldrin, go ahead and ask your question.
Yes. Hi. Thank
Hello.
you for the presentation. I have a question on the key metrics. So the NYSERS portfolio has a certain number of holdings, and the benchmark has a certain number of holdings. For the value of holdings in terms of dollar amount, while the benchmark has 87 more holdings, there's no difference in the dollar amount. Why is that?
Right. So, and Grace may be able to help with this as well. When we look at comparing the benchmark with the portfolio, we want to essentially make the analysis as though you were investing the same amount of money in the benchmark as you would be in the systems portfolio, so that you get an idea as to what the difference would be investing that same money in those two different ways.
But when you divide by the total carbon emissions, it seems like those 87 company holdings that have no revenue have no carbon emissions.
That have no...
It seems because if the number doesn't vary in the value of holdings for the benchmarks and the portfolio, and then you have increased emissions in the benchmark because it has more holdings, it seems like you're accounting for the emissions in the benchmark for the holdings, but not for the valuation.
Sure. Are you specifically this here?
No, this would be Table 1, Key Metrics.
Right, so it wouldn't be on the slides.
It was on the material that we were sent ahead of time, not in today's slides. It's page 7 of the presentation.
Page 7.
Yes.
For folks who have it on their iPads.
Can I ask for clarification? Are you most interested in the total carbon emissions or the carbon intensity measure associated with the benchmark, and what the difference would be based on the number of companies?
Yeah, since it's an equation dealing with the value of holdings and investments and the emissions, I was just curious as to why the number of companies in the portfolio and benchmark were different, right, by 87 companies. But then the value of the holdings didn't change.
Right.
And when you use that same number to equate to get at the value of the emissions.
I have it. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so essentially, when we look at the portfolio, we're always going to try to use the information on the actual amounts that are invested in the portfolio companies. For the benchmark, we're not actually going to take the total value of those companies, because you're not actually investing that money in the companies, and we're not going to actually look at the total market cap of those companies. What we're doing is we're essentially saying, here's what the total, so that total value of holdings for the benchmark, that number, that is assuming that if you did invest that much money in the benchmark using the weighting of the companies in the benchmark, you would have that total greenhouse gas numbers that is in the Table 1 summary. Does that help clarify? So you're really using that benchmark as though it was a portfolio, using those same weights, but saying if we invested the money instead of in our systems portfolio into the benchmark. So you wouldn't expect there to be a difference as far as the value of holdings used in that.
But then so the 126% of carbon efficiency then is just a factor of leaving out those emissions. So it's the equation is self-prophesizing.
No, the relative efficiency, that's looking specifically at the carbon intensity figures. And so those carbon intensity figures, what those carbon intensity figures look at is the total the total greenhouse gas emissions of the organization divided by the total revenue output of those organizations. So if you add companies in, you're not just adding the greenhouse gas emissions, you're also adding in their revenue, and so the equation balances out.
Okay.
Yeah, so for the benchmark.
You need to come to the microphone.
Okay.
Thanks.
So, like you're saying, there's 86 more companies in the benchmark. They're still considered because the weighting of the benchmark is still going to be 100%. We're just going to reweight all the holdings in it to equal that 100%. So it doesn't matter that there's 86 more companies. It's not like we're excluding them from the actual portfolio. They're just reweighted so that both the portfolio and the benchmark are going to be 100% on their own, and they're going to have that same value of holding. So we're not excluding anything from the portfolio.
And the total portfolio carbon emissions for the benchmark includes those 86 companies.
Yeah, but their weight is going to be maybe smaller because there's more companies in the benchmark, but they're included.
If I could.
Yeah.
So going back to this slide here, I think that part of the confusion is this. So when we look at the total greenhouse gas emissions for a particular system, we're not taking the total emissions of a company. So if you invest in Apple, we're not taking, let's say it's 100. We're not taking that 100. We're only going to take the small amount of that 100 that you actually own. So if you own, based on your value of holding, 1/10 of 1% of Apple, you will only receive 1/10 of 1% of that 100. So when we were calculating the total portfolio carbon emissions for the portfolio, that's the math that is used, is essentially summing up each of those portfolio holdings by the percentage of them, the percentage of the emissions that you own. So when we're looking at the benchmark and doing that same calculation, we're assuming that you're investing that same amount of money but using proportionally that information across all the holdings in the benchmark, using that same weighting that benchmark actually has. Does that help?
Not necessarily, but we could continue. I'll probably. It just seems that yes. It just seems that the benchmark has greater amounts of greenhouse emissions in the number compared to the portfolio because of those 86 companies, or some attribution there that's given to the greenhouse emissions that's artificially not being counted in the portfolio.
Right.
And that's what's driving the, but we can, I guess other people have questions and then we can discuss.
Happy to chat further.
Mr. Richter?
Roy Richter. And I went through your slides back and forth a couple times, but I guess the question is, what are we doing with this?
So I think the purpose of this analysis really was to get an initial understanding of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with, again, the equity holdings for the four systems. And really, there's a variety of things that can be done with it, but I think that this was an initial diagnostic.
So would this be something you bring up at the proxy committee?
Roy, I don't think this is this guy's true costs. Oh, but let me just say, you remember that we also hired a specialist consultant, Mercer, to study our portfolio and come back with recommendations. And I think that's happening. Mr. Evans, when is that supposed to happen?
Soon.
Well, don't let yourself get pinned down too much.
So I'm going to keep my greenhouse emissions down to the minimum, and I have no further questions. Thank you.
Spoken like a true prosecutor. Other questions? Mr. Khan, please introduce yourself.
Good morning, Umair Khan for the Public Advocate. So I had a few questions that are for True Cost and then perhaps a couple for BAM. I think the first ones would probably be for BAM. So I was looking at the RFP that was issued for this, and sorry, Pat, trying to get more information. I thought it was an excellent RFP, and there's some information here, and I just want to know if we would be getting this at some point, whether now or in future presentations. So one of the components that said that the potential consultant would do was to compare data of the carbon footprint of portfolio companies to that of industry peers, data on historical trends of portfolios' footprint to determine whether emissions have been increasing or decreasing, and then data on the carbon risk resulting from exposure to potential stranded assets such as
Question? He couldn't hear, you just talking to the mic. The last.
I'll take Andrew's. Look back. And then the last one was just the data on the portfolio's exposure to climate solutions. And I know Mercer's supposed to give us some information as well. And then just the last thing, and this is related to BAM as well, is there was a potential creation of a tool or an analytical tool where the Comptroller's office and the systems could use to analyze and evaluate our exposure. And so just wondering if those components are forthcoming, and if so, what would be the timeline for that?
Yeah, you want me to take that? That's a question to the BAM staff. I see Jimmy Ann walking up to the mic here. I think some of the things that you mentioned are part of the remit for Mercer, as opposed to True Cost. True Cost has a sort of specific designated assignment. Jimmy, why don't you sit right there? A specific dedicated assignment within it. But Jimmy is the guy overseeing all this, so he can help us. Turn your mic on.
And introduce yourself, Jimmy. And did you hear all the questions that Umair asked?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Jimmy Yan, I'm a special counsel in the Bureau of Asset Management. So I worked on the this project and the RFP committee, so evaluation committee. It's the RFPs spell out all the things that we're potentially interested in, and the evaluation committee in the end decided to go with a smaller range of services than what was listed in the RFP, based on what we thought was would be most useful and advantageous to the pension funds. So we those additional things were things of came at additional cost, and there's some unevenness among what the different proposers offered. So we opted to go with this this service of measuring these basic metrics, and we have the option of doing additional metrics and analysis as the board's desire.
And some of the analysis overlaps with the Mercer
that's true as well.
Assignment as well. So this is producing raw data that'll be used and analyzed by Mercer in a larger context when they come to us to talk about portfolio impacts of sustainability overall.
Joe, go ahead. Wait, hold on a sec, Joe. I think Umair has a follow-up.
So are we going to see an example of, say, 20 companies or 30 or 40, or are we going to be limited to 10 with the 20% exposure for NYSERS at least?
I'm not sure I understand the question. We have data on every company in the portfolio.
We do. Okay. So can we, it sounds like Umair would like that to be provided to the trustees. Is that
yes,
accurate?
please.
So can we get that data provided to the trustees?
Well, we'll have to follow up on that. I'm not sure if that is I guess let me refer that question to True Cost. Is that, are you able to provide us the complete database of emissions for all companies?
We did for the that's what we did for the portfolios.
Yeah. I mean, you
Okay,
couldn't have calculated those things without it. Yeah.
It was in the Excel file that we provided.
Okay, so you did. Okay,
that's
it's all in there. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Okay. So we can send that Excel file out to everybody.
And I believe that probably additional information in the report that.
Who are you?
I'm Susanna Vickers. And I would think that, a summary and some, reference to that database is in the report that was prepared for the trustees that's in your packet. And we can go over it if you like.
Sure.
So
I'm sorry. And this is just for true costs. So on slide 12 of the actual report, ExxonMobil and Sasol.
Can you identify yourself that we can't see who's talking?
Sorry, Scott, still Umair. And this is the last point. Their carbon intensity on page 12, carbon intensity rank in benchmark sector. ExxonMobil and Sasol are out of 187, and the rest of them are out of 166. Can you just explain why the difference?
Yeah, it's a different sector than that broad utility sector. It's based on our database goes much more granularly. We could group them differently. I believe that the information's in that larger Excel file that you could group them in this potential way.
Thank you.
So, I'm sorry. Officer Alejandro. you're
Yes,
up.
thank you, Mr. Facilitator.
Identify yourself, Joe.
Joseph Alejandro, New York City PBA, Police Pension Fund. Jimmy, I might have misheard you, but you said that there was a curtailing of some of the criteria in the contract, you said, in the contracting? What was that criteria that was curtailed, and why was it curtailed?
So the RFP asks for, asks proposers to tell us, can you do all of this, all these different things, and how much would it cost?
Okay.
So some of this, and we decided in the end that we felt that it wasn't, and we did present this initially when we presented on the selection of the vendor for the carbon footprint, and I apologize if maybe wasn't clear enough, but we decided on a narrower set of services or measures than what we had wrote out in the RFP, just because we thought that those were the most important metrics that that are standard or best practices, and the additional measures that we're looking for. So those are things like forward-looking data, data that shows what companies are doing in their how much they have in fossil fuel reserves, or how they're managing their carbon, how they're managing their activities related to carbon emissions. So how they look in the future in terms of how their practices and policies. Then there's information about that fossil fuel reserves. How much do people have in terms of that? Historical analysis, giving us a breakdown of how companies have trended in terms of, and sectors have trended in their carbon emissions over the years. So those are a few examples that the Public Advocates Office mentioned, and there are key ones that we were interested in our RFP to hear from folks. Do you do that? How do you do it? And how much would it cost? So in the end, the committee determined that for a variety of reasons, for example, the data quality for some of those things, like the future forward-looking metrics, are more the data quality is not as strong. Then the use of the other metrics was not as just not as common. And so that, combined with price, we decided to go with these basic measures so that the funds can get the essential understanding of the carbon footprint, and then we have the option of getting analysis of the different measures, and the boards can discuss that as well.
No, I appreciate that answer. I apologize for the follow-up. I might have missed, only because my tardiness here, but I might have missed if you addressed it before. Who was on the committee?
So it was me, Mike Garland, who our Assistant Controller for Corporate Governance, John Mersberg, our Head of Public Equity. It's been a while, and forgetting, there's, I think,
If I can interrupt, probably
One
the
more.
point is, Joe, if you're asking, yes, it was internal controller's
sorry.
office staff that reviewed the proposal, that drafted the RFP, reviewed the proposals that came back, and then made a presentation to the board. And we're looking in convene to try to find the date of that. And the engagement was approved by the board before we hired True Cost.
And when we presented this to the board, Jimmy went through, what we had done in the,
You mean the board that was selected to
no,
review this? or to
you
us?
all.
Okay.
Yeah, so we presented, when we decided that, when we recommended the choice of True Cost, we went through the process that the RFP committee went through, the narrowing of the scope, et cetera. And so this was discussed before.
No, I
yeah.
appreciate that, Scott.
Yeah.
I just don't recall if there was a delineation of the criteria that was omitted for what was actually inserted into the final proposal. And my question here is, and my ultimate follow-up is, would the introduction of those have changed the actual results of the study dramatically? We don't know, right? Can you tell me that?
Well, I wouldn't say that they changed results. I guess it's
No, I
different.
agree.
Yeah, I mean the core. What our peers are doing are measuring just these metrics, and they're not certainly on any regular basis measuring any of these
With
other.
or without the criteria that you omitted originally?
Yeah, I guess I would call them like measures or metrics rather than criteria. So it's kind of like measuring batting average and RBI versus based on ball walks. So I think this is maybe a very rough analogy, but we decided to focus on batting average, RBIs, and home runs versus fielding percentage. Or sorry for the sports analogy, but
Well, if you're going to go down that
so in
road,
this case, he's one.
people who follow SABRE would disagree with you. Those are the
yeah, then that's a whole sorry, a whole new
So I'm just
controversy.
trying to get to what I'm trying to get to is ultimately there's a study done. You guys selected the criteria, and I'm just trying to determine if the omitted criteria would have changed, for better or for worse, the result, and that way we could get an understanding of, are we on the right track? I had no say in what was ultimately omitted. We only approved ultimately what you did, okay?
Yeah.
And so, from a perspective that I could be questioned later on regarding any of this stuff, I need to understand, yes, there was other criteria was omitted in order to do this, and that will color my ultimate decisions down the road regarding some of this.
I would like to call your attention, Joe, to in convene in the online library. There's a file from 2016, and in November 2016, there's a very detailed memo that goes through all of this that was presented to the trustees. And I think that it shows that, sort of decisions had to be made at that point. And I don't think now, a year later, we can.
Your question, it's what we're doing is standard and best practice. So the other metrics that we didn't just follow up on in this RFP, they're not metrics that other peer pension funds do normally. So in terms of prevailing industry
They're not
practice,
metrics that other
they're
funds are
not.
following? Okay.
Yeah, so they're really kind of extra bonus metrics in a sense that are not common or standard.
Here, Mike.
Okay, hold on. Let's just
Yeah, Mike may have a third.
Mike Garland from the Controller's Office. So let me just add a little context. The RFP was written internally as a wish list by people who are non-expert in the field. So it's very broad. A lot of hard work went into it. We then had various vendors come in and say, here's what we're capable of doing. Here's what makes sense. So our decisions were really based on being informed by the process. No effort, no intent to exclude anything that would somehow bias the result.
And that's the answer I'm trying to get at, is that there's no intent to
Zero.
get this report right.
Okay.
So I appreciate that's the answer. Thank you.
Okay, so additional questions? Ray, do you still have a question? Yeah. Ray Sanchez. Can someone get a mic in front of that man?
more simply, I guess, why not, just walk me through why not, for the purpose of benchmarking, have a second benchmark that is the Russell 3000 instead of, to give us a better, more of a sense of where we, would that add value? Would that add value? Given that, when we look at market performance, we compare it to the Russell 3000, and we do have a same amount of passive and some active in our equity portfolio, and 90%, I think, of the portfolio, right, is across the 4 or 5 funds is consistent. Would that be more educational or instructive? If so, if not, why?
So specifically about I may have to refer to Grace on the information we received on the benchmarks, but my understanding is that the information received was specifically the benchmarks that are used to measure financial performance. Yeah. So it was literally taking that same information, the same weightings were applied and just aggregated together into one benchmark for the system.
So the Russell 3000 is part of the composite benchmark, and they would take the Russell 3000 times that portion of the composite benchmark.
Correct.
MSCI EFA is part of it, MSCI emerging markets, et cetera, so that it's the same composite benchmark that we use to measure everything else.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that, because I'm confused? Yes, John Adler. John Adler, Mayor's Office of Pensions and Investments. The question is, so the benchmark has 3,795 companies. My understanding is we invest in many more companies. We invest in the public equity of many more companies than that globally. This is a global study, right? So what is in there and what's missing? In other words, if you take EFA, the EMI index, Emerging Markets Index that we use, and Russell 3000, there's a lot more than 3,795 companies in there.
Yeah, so I can answer essentially within our database. The Trucost has a huge database of company environmental data, including their greenhouse gas emissions data, and we took the holdings across each system and matched it to our database. And essentially, there were companies that were excluded that were on the long tail. So we cover over 90% of the value of holdings of all the holdings in the system, but there's many of those smaller companies that make up a small proportion of the total investments that were not included in the analysis because they're not in the database. So we essentially use best practice, which is to ensure that you have the large contributors and make sure that you have the majority of the total value of the system covered. But that's the reason that you're not going to see exactly, if it was 11,000 companies, you're not going to see 11,000 companies.
And can I just ask a question about that?
Of course.
Is there a bias in the reporting of the data? And you may not know the answer to this question, but in other words, the companies for which you don't have data, they're not reporting data. And is it possible that they're not reporting data because some of them, at least, their greenhouse gas emissions are through the roof and they don't really want to publicize that?
Right. You're not going to get, for the companies included in the scope, you're not going to get a reporting bias because we use a sophisticated model to fill in the blanks when there are companies in our database that do not disclose. Ideally, companies are going to have third-party verified, really robust disclosure. In the case that they don't, we use other techniques to calculate what their likely greenhouse gas emissions are going to be. So when you're talking about companies that were just excluded from the analysis, those were just not in our database. But companies that are in our database may or may not disclose.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
So you're not getting a reporting bias, is the short answer.
Ms. Stryker.
Patricia Stryker. I have an extremely important question.
Of course.
What bridge is this? Do we know what bridge this is?
Stock photograph.
Okay.
We don't know, but I'll sell it to you. Mr. Bonilla.
I'm sorry, Mr. Who?
Bonilla.
In where it says company reporting assessment, you say Trucost will provide New York City Comptroller's Office with the underlying data, which was discussed earlier for the NYSERS portfolio, to identify companies for engagement, including, well, so in terms of next steps, here you have like engagement, and I know divestment, engagement, there's a continuum of different next steps that can be foreseeable. In regards to engagement, how do you have a utility company or energy company not be a utility company or energy company? And what areas around the margins have you seen have been successful engagement strategies and initiatives?
Yeah, a little bit outside the scope of as far as the quantitative results, but there you can engage in dialogue with companies in a variety of ways, and some of it just has to do with accounting for their greenhouse gas emissions, looking at best practice, assessing long-term impacts of climate change on their company, things of that nature. It doesn't necessarily have to be proposing specific changes to their business. Can be that too.
In some ways, that's more in the Mercer, in the scope of the Mercer study than I think the True Cost study. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Bonilla.
So, and hopefully this is within the scope of it. So scope 1 and scope 2, I know there's been a great deal of evolution around carbon footprint analysis and what to be included in scope 1 and scope 2. In terms of the recent evolution dealing with packaging and distribution and waste production at the post-consumer level, what is scope 2 included in post-consumer manufacturer responsibility, and are those numbers included in the greenhouse emissions?
Yeah, so downstream emissions is what we'd categorize that. So things that are at the consumer level, that's included out. That's not included in the scope. That would be what they classify as part of scope 3.
Okay.
I want to ask a follow-up on that on scope 3. So I understood scope 3 to primarily be supply chain, contractors, that kind of thing. Is that right?
That's a component. There's not to overcomplicate. There's 15 categories of scope 3.
And let me just ask a question about that. I suppose it's general, but some companies, and you had mentioned Apple before, they do very little manufacturing themselves. It's all contracted out.
Yes.
Virtually all of it. So, where you have companies like that, where you have a lot of contracting out, in some ways the scope 1 and scope 2 is a little bit misleading, right? Is that an accurate description?
If you're looking to get a full understanding of a company like Apple or Nike that are largely outsourcing their manufacturing, I'd say that's a fair statement.
And do you guys, if we had asked you to, do you do measurements on scope 3 as well?
Yeah, and specifically the area you're talking about is on the supply chain, and
yes,
we do have that. Mm-hmm.
And so can I just ask generally, would the numbers, look significantly different if you included at least the supply chain piece of scope 3?
From an absolute perspective, so the total tons of greenhouse gas emissions, it would be significantly higher. Okay. As far as from an intensity perspective, it would be relatively higher.
Okay. And part of the reason I asked the question, and part of, I believe, the purpose for doing this study is to create a baseline, so that if all or some of the funds decide to take steps to address our carbon footprint in the future, we now have a baseline from which to measure it, right? So that, if we decide to do something or other, we can then come back 1 year, 2 years, 3 years from now and say, okay, our carbon footprint using the same methodology now is X as opposed to what it was in 2017 when it was Y, right? Okay, other questions for True Cost?
Right here.
Mr. Brown, identify yourself.
Edward
please.
Brown, UFA. Who do we pay to lower our footprint?
I pose that to BAM. I think that's a BAM question.
That's actually a joke.
Oh, okay, it's a joke.
Then I have no further comment.
Okay. Other questions? So I just have one other question. I'm sorry. The Montreal Pledge, which you mentioned before, I don't think that we're signatories to that, but would having carried out this footprint analysis, if we were to continue to do it on an annual basis, either with you or without you, would that mean that we would be eligible to sign the Montreal Pledge? I just want to understand whether we've done what we're supposed to do.
It's certainly en route to that, but I couldn't speak directly to if that would meet all of the requirements
see.
or the requests.
Okay. Something maybe we could ask BAM to look into? Thank you.
It's Ben Schuldner, just one second.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Ben. And where are you
Mike
from?
may want to make a comment on she wanted to make a comment on Montreal.
Briefly.
Oh, sorry, let's have Mike go
I
on.
think the answer is yes, because the Montreal Pledge, in part, is aspirational. It's a commitment to do the footprinting, and I'm fairly confident that you have already essentially, you could sign it today, even before you had done this, and the fact that you did this, you would be compliant.
Great,
It doesn't
thank
set out very specific metrics.
Thanks, Mike. Ben.
Good morning, everybody. Ben Schuldner from Burrs. I really just wanted to kind of piggyback on the comment that was made. If the whole premise of this is to actually understand where we sit in terms of the carbon footprint, it seems almost absurd to not include the chain from the creation of an object to it being then sold by another company. Having spent a lot of time with things like sweatshop labor laws and trying to help workers, it is absurd to think that we wouldn't want that information, because it's so easy to just create another shell and another company and to just say, well, it's not ours. Well, we just subcontract out. And I would just urge that all my brothers and sisters around this wonderful table see the obfuscation that could occur so quickly. So the fact that we would want to get the best understanding of where these kinds of emissions come from would be just fantastic. And so the more information we have, the better. But I could certainly understand the desire to get things done quickly, and if the first analysis is on the companies themselves, that's fine. And unless I completely misread the point, I thought that's what was being asked. So I just want to urge that I would love the analysis to be deeper, and as you said, it would actually be significant to understand where the products themselves are being made, that we would then reap the benefits as shareholders of a larger company.
Just to address that, Ben, maybe you weren't here when we were talking about the engagement earlier, but, the parameters of the engagement was developed,
Sure.
through a committee in BAM and discussed and approved by the board. So if
Gotcha.
any obfuscation occurred, maybe the
Sure.
trustees who attend these meetings, including yourself,
Sure.
participated in that. So I would just really think that you should look into, the online library and the information that you've received in the past. And if you, wanted to make changes to that, there were many, many opportunities. And right now, we have a process going forward with True Cost and also with Mercer. So if you have any suggestions, it's probably, too late because all of the RFPs and all of the procurements
Susanna,
have been done.
Can I also, I'll help and address the point, Ben.
I can continue to get berated. That's fine.
No, but I think
I'm used to it. I was a high school principal for 10 years.
The question
Ben,
is,
wait.
why aren't we
Mike.
looking at Scope 3
Yeah.
emissions? It is not an answerable question today. You're asking for something that cannot be performed. Even what you're looking at now, I would say the integrity of the underlying information, and I would, interested in True Cost thoughts, but it's uneven quality. When you go to Scope 3, you're out in an area where no one really, that's the next frontier. Is that a fair analysis? Or?
Yeah, and to be honest, my point was I hope that we move towards Scope 3 to get a better understanding. The fact that we are starting with 1 and 2 is fine, and certainly maybe it is possible that we were told that Scope 3 wasn't really in the cards, so there was decisions to be made for 1 and 2. But I'm just saying, having heard both your comments and the comments beforehand, that a truer picture would be done with a Scope 3, I just hope that we would be able to move forward towards that with all deliberate speed.
Yeah, and I would just remind you that, again, it is the responsibility of the board, the trustees here around the table, your brothers and sisters, who are informing BAM of how BAM should carry out your instructions.
And I'll assure you that we'll take your input seriously and let you know just that the standard and best practice in the industry thus far is limiting it to Scope 1 and 2. So ideally, we'd have good, reliable data for Scope 3, but the prevailing and best practice is not quite there yet.
Fair enough. I've never been one to follow best practices of an industry that I have questions about.
Mr. Facilitator?
Okay, Joe, did you want to say
Just one comment.
Who are you?
Joe Alejandro, New York City Police. And I appreciate the fact that there's constant reference to past documents in the library. However, each trustee brings to bear whatever knowledge they have in the decision-making process. We don't all have staffs to decipher a lot of the information, to look at every little document that comes across. However, we are held to the standard that we're responsible for the ultimate decision made by the board. So a lot of times, a trustee may not remember the document, and I think it's unfair to constantly refer to documents that are sitting in an archive from a year or two ago, and when a trustee's asking a question that's germane to the decision they're going to make at that time, today. Okay? So if we're going to keep doing that, then I think at the end, then all the trustees, and I would make the recommendation, you take the time necessary to make the decision where you feel comfortable and look at every T crossed and every I dotted in a document before you vote. If that's what we're going to do, I think, that's just going to hold up the process quite dramatically. That's my comment.
Thank you, Joe. Any other questions or comments for True Cost, or should we keep, arguing among ourselves?
So,
Yes, Mr. Khan. And
Umair
who are
Khan
you?
For the Public
Yes, thank you.
Advocate. So could we
I'm
just...
sorry, one more time.
Umair Khan for the Public Advocate. So I was just going, I've only gone through the materials here, but what will be the next step? Will there, can we get, what's the timeline? Because, we did this press conference announcement back in February. The RFP is from June of last year. So I'm just trying to get an understanding of what is the process and what is the timeline for what BAM is envisioning, whether with True Cost and or with Mercer, just so that we have a fuller understanding of what's to be expected.
Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Amir. So this is providing us with basic data, and we've been talking back and forth about whether we have the full basic data set and everything else, but this is basic data about emissions. As you know, we've contracted with Mercer to come in and evaluate the portfolio and give us some thoughts about sustainability and how we approach this. And this is one of the important data sets that will be used both with the analysis of the portfolio, recommendations on sustainable practices in the portfolio, and with potential engagement with companies. We now have a good understanding of exactly what the carbon emissions are in the portfolio. We can compare that both to other benchmarks and other portfolios in the marketplace, in the public space. So it's coming. But the next step will be to hear from Mercer and to evaluate our options with Mercer and to proceed from there. And Jimmy, when are we on the calendar to come in with Mercer roughly?
November. So
Yeah.
there will be two more presentations from Mercer. Next one is November, and then a final one. So it should be in January.
Yeah. So it's coming soon.
Okay. Further questions for True Cost? Great. Thanks very much for coming in. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, folks, we're going to do two more things right now. First off, can I ask trustees from NYSERS, first from NYSERS that came in since the roll call, to introduce themselves? You should use the mic.
Isaac Gordetsky, Staten Island Borough President's Office.
Okay, from Fire?
Doug White.
Okay, and from Police?
Joe Alejandro, New York City PBA.
Very good. Okay, so now we are going to ask the teachers. We have one more, sorry. Introduce yourself for the record, Chris.
Yeah, Chris Monahan, designee, Roy Richter, CEA.
What happened to Roy? We lost Roy. Okay. Okay, we're going to ask the teachers to introduce themselves. We're going to do a roll call for teachers, sorry. So who's here to do the roll call? Pat? Okay, Thad? Great.
That's Pat?
Thad McTeague is going to do the teachers' roll call.
Mr. Adler?
Yes, I'm here.
Mr. Brown?
Use your mic, Thad. We can't hear you, sorry.
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Kazansky?
Present?
Ms. Penny? She's here. Mr. Orlando?
I'm present.
And Ms. Vickers?
Ms. Vickers is present, but John Dorsa for the, okay.
Okay.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Okay. Okay, so now we're going to ask each board to take a vote to go into executive session. So let's start with teachers, since we know you're all here. Is there a motion to enter executive session?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'm sorry.
All right, you need the name. So when you make the motion, please give your name.
David Kazansky.
Okay.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Tom Brown, second.
Great. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion at teachers to enter executive session, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, motion carries. NICERS, can we get a motion to move into executive session?
So moved.
Introduce yourself, sorry. Who's making the motion?
Borough President Diaz's office.
Okay, and second?
Second, Andrew Gennardis.
I'm sorry. Didn't hear it.
Seconded, Andrew Gennardis.
Okay. Motion made and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion at NICERS to enter executive session, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, motion carries. Fire, is there a motion to enter executive session?
Doug White, so moved.
Thank you. Is there a second? That was Douglas White. Is there a second?
Second, John Farina.
Thank you, Mr. Farina. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to enter executive session at Fire, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, motion carries. And Police, is there a motion to enter executive session?
Lou Turco, LBA.
Thank you. Is there a second?
John Dorsa, Controller's Office.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to enter executive session at Police, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. Okay, we're now in executive session at all four of the systems that are here meeting, blah, 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 yes, that have quorum.
Okay, so we are back in public session, and we'll turn it over to Sue Thang for the recap.
Great. A presentation on a real estate deal was presented and discussed. Consensus was reached, which will be announced at the appropriate time. 2 implementation plans for 2 asset classes were presented and discussed. Consensus was reached, which will be announced at the appropriate time. And a presentation on markets manager was received and discussed. Consensus was reached, will be announced at the appropriate time.
Any other further business?
No further business.
If not, I believe a motion to adjourn is in order.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.
Thank you.
All right.
Great. Welcome back to the public session for NICERS. Millie, would you please report out of executive session?
The board approved 1 real estate investment, the opportunistic fixed income annual implementation plan, the bank loans annual implementation plan, the resolution to clarify divestment parameters and process previously approved, and the private equity annual implementation plan, the details of which will be disclosed at a later date.
Great. Thank you so much. And with that, I think a motion to adjourn would be in order.
So moved, Mr. Eckler.
Thank you, Mr. Bernard. Is there a second?
Second.
Who said that?
Right.
Is there any doubt?
Is it Carol?
Mikhail? Yes.
I don't see. I just wanted the secret cameras. Okay.
Usually we do that.
Okay, we now need a motion to. Somebody's having a lot of fun someplace. Okay.
Cops have been making fun of its face for years.
session of the meeting?
So moved. Second.
Any objections? Hearing none, motion carries. During the executive session, the board discussed various investment matters, viewed certain personnel decisions, and made some decisions. We now need a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn? Second.
Any objections?
Recommendations from the Comptroller's Office and its consultants regarding several items. Specifically, the trustees approved an investment in the asset class of real estate, details to be made public at the appropriate time. And the trustees approved annual implementation plans in the asset classes of alternative credit, private equity, and hedge funds.
So with that, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn. I'll second. So we're adjourned. Thank you.